Welcome back, everybody. Peter Maravellis here on behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers, the City Lights Foundation, and our partners at PM Press. I'd like to welcome you to session 3 of Dangerous Visions and New Worlds. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples. This session is called Wild Seed, Reflecting on the Work and Impact of Octavia Butler. It will be moderated by Mimi Mondal and feature Alexis Pauline Gumbs and Adrienne Marie Brown. Now, because of the time zone difficulties experienced by our participants, we had to pre-record this event to accommodate everyone. It was recorded on Friday, February the 4th. So a few words about our participants. So Mimi Mondal is a Hugo and Nebula Award nominated author of science fiction and fantasy. She is also a columnist writing about history, politics, technology, and futures. She is the co-editor of Luminescent Threads, Connections to Octavia E. Butler, an anthology of letters and essays which received a Locus Award in 2018. Ms. Mondal has also been a poetry and reprint editor of Uncanny Magazine, a 3 times Hugo Award-winning magazine of science fiction and fantasy. She is an editor at Penguin Random House in India. So joining her will be Alexis Pauline Gumbs. Alexis Pauline Gumbs is a writer, independent scholar, poet, dramaturg, activist, and educator based in Durham, North Carolina. Ms. Gumbs was the Winton Chair in the Liberal Arts in the Department of Theater and Arts and Dance at the University of Minnesota from 2017 to 2019. She is the founder and director of Eternal Summer of the Black Feminist Mind and founder of Broken Beautiful Press. She is the dramaturg for Dat Black Mermaid Man Lady, a performance by Sharon Bridgeforth. And also joining them today is going to be Adrienne Marie Brown. Adrienne Marie Brown is a writer, doula, activist, and Black feminist. From 2006 through 2010, she was the executive director of the Ruckus Society. She is the author of the books Emergent Strategy, Pleasure, Activism, The Politics of Feeling Good, We Will Not Cancel Us as well. And she has served as a social justice facilitator at the World Social Forum and worked extensively with social justice organizations in the Detroit area. In 2010, she published the Octavia Butler Strategic Reader with Alexis Pauline Gumbs. And in 2013, she received the Detroit Knights Arts Challenge Award to run a series of Octavia Butler-based science fiction workshops. So I'm going to be posting links for Dangerous Visions. You may purchase them. And also we're going to be posting links for the author's titles as well. So just give me a moment and I will get this started. Thanks for your patience, everyone.
Hello, and thank you to PM Press and City Lights Bookstore for facilitating this conversation. It's called Wild Seed, Reflecting on the Work and Impact of Octavia E. Butler. And I'm speaking to Adrienne Marie Brown and Alexis Pauline Gumbs in the beginning. And so I wanted to start with Adrienne and Alexis. You both probably know a lot more about Octavia Butler than I do, and you have worked on her works for a very long time. And I wanted to come into this about with starting to talk about the Octavia Butler Strategic Reader that you both did, I think in 2010. And I used many of the questions in there when I did a workshop on Butler's works 2 years ago. So I just wanted to hear a little bit about that from both of you.
Yeah, well, first of all, Mimi, it's nice to meet you. I am a fan of Luminescent Thread, and I am excited to be in contact. And Alexis and I have known each other, as you said, for a long time. But I feel like the sci-fi world it's not that big, and yet it's like possible to go for a long time without getting to see and meet everyone. So it's good to meet you. in this way. And, you know, what I think happened was Alexis, so you know, I'm just working on a 5-year zine because it's been 5 years since Emergent Strategy came out.
Right.
And in order to write the zine, I'm having to go back and remember like, oh yeah, we did this workshop at the Allied Media Conference. And at the workshop, it was so magical because it was really like, you know, I think there's something here where we could look at Octavia Butler and learn how to be organizers better from her. Does anyone else think that's a good idea? And the room was so packed, like, yeah. I mean, so it just felt like one of those like, oh, we're doing something very exciting and we know it and we're all in here. And we had people at one point break into small groups to talk about specific texts or collections. So it's like the Parables crew was over here, the Xenogenesis folks were over here. We had a Kindred crew. We had some folks who were just looking at like the short stories. So, and Pattern Master crew. And so folks generated like what reading questions, what comes up for you as like, if you were making a study guide for these texts, what comes up? And at the end we were like, this is rich. Like we have, you know, we have notes and everything. And I was like, Alexis, can we make this into something somewhat coherent? And I look back at it now, it's like such a little beginner baby zine, you know, like it probably could use some revisiting and revision, but it was such a cool project to do. And it felt like the first, like, there's something here.
Yeah, and I think it came, am I right? Because now you looked back more recently, because I'm like, that's 12 years ago. It came after this collaboration of this science fiction transformative justice.
No, that was, I think that it came
the other way.
It was the other way. So it was like
We
first
started
we
with Octavia.
the Octavia thing, and then we did that. And then when we, after that, like maybe, so that summer we brought back that zine and we were like, look, y'all. And then we had the workshop the following summer, which I'll never forget, in 2012, because I had the best outfit, like this lavender.
It was gorgeous.
Dress. It was like my favorite, it's my favorite thing I've ever worn to an Allied Media Conference. And all the pictures of it, I'm just like, that's my outfit. But it was you and myself, Jenna and Leah, and we did a workshop on transformative justice and science fiction, and that also led to a zine. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that you're right. I mean, it was just, there was so much energy in the room. And I think there was also this feeling that there were a lot of people in the space who had been reading Octavia Butler, nerding out by themselves, and didn't necessarily realize other people in movement were doing the same thing, right? So I think there was like a where have you been all my life type of feeling in that room. We're like, oh my God, yes, finally. Yeah, all sparked from your vision. So it was beautiful to witness and participate in.
Well, and you know, Mimi, I think it's interesting too, because it feels like around this same period of time, it feels like so many people were like, Octavia's been gone, you know, we need to continue her work and we need to get people paying attention to her work. And so it was like, okay, we're moving towards the zine. We ended up moving towards Octavia's Brood, and you were moving towards the luminescent thread. So do you want to share a little bit about where that thread began for you?
Sure. So since you brought up Luminescent Threads, which is an anthology that I worked on in 2017, and since then I have done like a number of events and other things about Octavia Butler, and which makes me very embarrassed in some ways, because I came to the United States in 2015, and my first time was as an Octavia Butler scholar at the Clarion West workshop.
Oh, cool.
So basically, I managed to come to the United States because she passed away, and some people started a scholarship in her name.
At Clarion, right?
Yes, and otherwise I couldn't afford to come here, and maybe also not do a science fiction workshop, right?
Yeah.
Because, you know,
workshops
are a bit of a luxury. And when I came in, I knew very little of her work. Like I had read Bloodchild. I grew up in India, and I guess, a little, at the cusp of the internet age. So we were internet people, but we didn't grow up completely with the internet. And what I realized after I came here is that like there was such a tremendously activated community about Octavia Butler, like which you don't see necessarily about every other author, every other science fiction author from even her period or from earlier. Like, the Octavia Butler community, if you meet them, like as Alexis pointed out, like of course there are many people who grew up reading her and didn't know each other. But like every time I've walked into a room of like Octavia Butler enthusiasts, I mean, besides the fact that many of them had probably met her, I've seen everybody who's been like tremendously transformed by her works. Like it's not very dry academic, right? Like it's very activated and it's very proactive people. It's people, speaking from the heart a lot.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's the same thing I saw in the essay that's in this book, Dangerous Visions and New Worlds. It's written by Michael A. Gonzalez. And once again, like it's a very intimate essay. Like it's an essay where you can see that this person loves this author and probably as a person as well, right? And I had not read much of her work at all. And I had read Bloodchild in an anthology that like came out to India at that time. Like India got very few science fiction works and mostly the classic and largely like white male classics besides Ursula K, right? Yeah. And I read her short story. I did not notice that she was a Black woman. And that is something that like amazes me right now, because like that anthology did not really introduce many of the people. And I probably just didn't think people of color wrote science fiction back then. Because not many Indians were doing that, at least in English. I mean, which also makes me think about like the way these anthologies, especially in the last generation, the ones that were done by especially the bigger publishers, they really sanitized, they really whitewashed a lot of marginalized people, right? And
I'm like, I mean, I think that's part of where, I think about Cherie Renee Thomas and how for me, and maybe that was one of the anthologies you saw or that made it to you, but I feel like for me, her work with Dark Matter of starting to pull it together and provide a legacy that's like, we're here, we've been here, but a lot of our stuff doesn't get published, or when it does, the cover gets changed in a way that sort of takes it away from being a visibly Black story. Like if you're looking for like, what is this protagonist? And that happened to some of Octavia's work early on too, but I feel like Dark Matter drew a line, and it was just like, actually, these are Black authors, this is Black work. And when we were doing, we just missed each other. I was at Clarion in 2014, I believe. And then in 2015, Octavia's Brood was released. And, we were like, we want to pick up those threads of what Dark Matter was doing. And we had Cherie come on as an editor. But we also wanted to pick up the threads of what Octavia was doing and look at like, what does it mean not just to be people of color, Black people, brown people, women, disabled people, trans people writing science fiction, but what are the values that are imbued in that, so that it's, it's not representational, but it's actually transformative. And it feels like, going back, I mean, now I feel like I spend every day with Octavia. Like I feel like some of my day every day is spent with her, which is a testament to the work that she put out. Cause I'm like, it's just that rich that it keeps on giving. But studying it now, I'm like so grateful for the anthologies that all of us have been crafting and collecting and gathering and sharing, because it feels like this is the time when we need them. Like she was prophetically speaking directly to this moment for the parables. And it feels like we were like, okay, what's everything else we need to write to get ourselves ready for the parables? And that makes me want to bring in Alexis's Undrowned work, because I feel like Octavia gave it the experience of Dolphin, and then you took that so much further. And can you just speak a little bit to where you see Undrowned fitting into this larger pattern?
Yeah, well, right. So I think I was 11 when I first read Wild Seed, and it's been so incredible to revisit it through the podcast with you and Toshi.
So
It's been
exciting.
like, I mean, it's my favorite Octavia Butler
Me
novel.
too.
Like, just
Although it's really hard, like revisiting it, I was like, I always forget how hard it is because I'm just like, dolphins. And like, oh wait.
I mean, and that's the thing. Like, all of her novels are hard. You know, like there's
Very
no like,
hard.
there's no relaxing Octavia Butler novel, short story, or I mean, probably even like conversation.
No.
I mean, having looked at the interviews, so
She was like, oh, I don't agree with this question. No.
exactly. And I don't know, maybe that's part of also why it stays with us, or these moments of pleasure, right? So that the moment in Wild Seed that's like, Anyanwu is a dolphin. She's like about to be in love with another dolphin. She's experiencing what it is to be part of a pod. And it's juxtaposed directly to like, she jumps off an enslaving vessel where people are captive, being brought from Africa to the Americas, and experiences this different mammal sociality. And Charles McKinney, the great historian Charles McKinney, was at that time a graduate student at Duke University, and his summer job was teaching this enrichment program. I was one of the kids in the enrichment program. And he is not a literary scholar. He's a historian. He's one of the premier historians of the civil rights movement. And he was like, well, if you're going to learn about the Middle Passage, maybe this is a way. And I haven't even asked him. I would love to ask him, like, why, instead of a primary historical text, why, instead of a picture or a manifest of a ship, or, why did you decide that Octavia Butler science fiction would be the way to teach young people about the Middle Passage? But it's been connected for me ever since. And Undrowned is really in kinship with that moment of like, what is it to understand marine mammals, how they live, what they do, but also their sociality, how they relate to each other, how they relate to their environment as an alternative that's not separate from what it is as, for me, as a descendant of people who survived the Middle Passage and who didn't survive the Middle Passage, to think about what it is to be alive, what it is to be social, what it is to be together. And so I definitely feel like Undrowned is me continuing to, indulge also my 11-year-old self, continue to ask this question of honestly, I don't know if I'll ever stop writing. I just wrote something this week that I'm like, it's the same question, it's not the same work, but it's it's like, I'm thinking about ableism, and I'm in this process of listening. I'm always in a process of ancestral listening, but I've been in a process of ancestral listening to an ancestor of mine who was disabled and nonverbal. And like, how do I listen for sound differently? How do I acknowledge how much the verbal just completely crowds my experience of everything? There's a word for everything. I'm a hyperverbal person. You can tell. I've just said a whole zillion words. But it comes back to that question of what I think that there's a beautiful way, and you bring this out so incredibly in emergent strategy, and I would love to hear what you've been noticing as you've been reflecting on the 5 years, because Octavia Butler consistently turns to major theological texts, or like sacred texts, like Taoist texts, the Bible, all of it, the I Ching, and then she turns to nature, right? Like the way these particular bugs reproduce in Bloodchild, and these dolphins and leopards in Wild Seed, and it's never removed from that.
Yeah.
And I think that she had that, she writes about that in the collection Bloodchild, about that as a practice for her of being like afraid of a lot of things about nature, growing up without having a lot of opportunities to be immersed in nature beyond the urban nature of Pasadena. She had a lot of fear there. And so she went towards it, to learn about what animals in particular could teach her about sociality, about what she might have theorized as human nature when you take it beyond the context of the present or even the planet.
I love that. Mimi, were you going to say something?
Yes. Thank you, Alexis, for you actually answered one of the questions that I wanted to ask, which was about mostly both of your academic practices, your intellectual practices, because you both come from like very, various disciplines, and you've used Octavia Butler's work in many forms. And I also kind of want to know how you approach her work in teaching, because you both teach various categories of students, right? And I just wanted to hear a little about your experiences of like, maybe not introducing, maybe some of your students would already have read her work. How do you interact with her work in your teaching practice?
Well, I would say one of the things that has blown my mind has been that intersection of like, there's tons of people who've read her work, but feel excited by the idea of being invited to practice it, being like, oh, like I could be earthseed, do earthseed, like I could get my go bag together, what is my shape-shifting capacity? Like what would make me someone that aliens would want to save? What, some of the things that she was asking and doing. But primarily the parables wisdom I have found really useful for this time as a teacher of like, people get so excited about that. So there's people who are like, what? And then there's people who have never come across her and maybe are survivalist, usually are scared, feeling some level of climate despair, societal despair. And one of the things I always love about Octavia Butler's work and about her as a person was she was like, she didn't self-identify as writing hopeful text, right? I think she might be amazed and surprised at how hopeful it is for those of us who are living through this stage of late stage capitalism and climate catastrophe, that it is actually quite hopeful to have something that is so grounding and that is like, you have to get in right relationship with change. So I find that I bring her text into everything that I do as a way, the same way I think that the historian Charles McKinney did, is like, I bring it in because I'm like, you can't imagine this. And someone did that. Someone actually thought through, what would it be like if this happened? What if this goes on, right? If we keep isolating and building borders and fences and walls, then we end up with gated communities where people are outside not having stuff or inside having stuff, and that's untenable. And then what happens? And I think that one of the best things we can be doing for people right now is teaching them, how do we survive this period? How do we survive this moment in history? And I also think there's something around teaching people that you don't know who you're going to end up in the apocalypse with. So this has been, I always think that this is one of the biggest lessons of Octavia's work is like, we, for a long time, at least when I was first starting out as a little baby revolutionary radical, it was like, we're going to form an intentional community and a squad, and we're all going to roll everywhere together. It's just going to be like that. But then when I think about the apocalyptic moments in my life, like being in Manhattan on 9/11 or being in Italy at the beginning of COVID-19, like there's these moments where it's like, oh, I'm not with who I thought I was going to be with. I can't get to them. I can't even reach them. And I've got to still figure out how to get safe and if I can get to them. And I find Octavia to be super helpful there. Like during COVID, I say her words, kindness eases change, all the time. when thinking about abolition, I think of her words, belief initiates and guides action or it does nothing. So in teaching her work, I really try to teach from, here's how she's helped me survive, and maybe she could help you survive. And it's important to listen to this Black woman surviving. I also love to teach people about what it is to be an awkward Black person who doesn't fit into the molds that society approves of or uplifts or celebrates. You know, she and I have different awkwardnesses or different reasons that society would reject us, right? Like, she was really tall, I'm really fat, you know, like we just have these different things, but there's this common experience of, oh, I keep showing up in this space and no one expects me to be there and no one wants me to be the leader and no one wants to listen. And Octavia teaches us, like, assert yourself for the sake of the future. Like, her protagonists are also all these awkward Black girls who are like, I'm grumpy and I'm not gonna like make this easy for you and we're gonna still get there. And so I think there's the teaching of her as a person, the teaching of what she wrote, the teaching of like getting people to go and actually read it. And then this last period, which is like, how do we pull from her work and uplift the parts of it that people need to survive? And so, you know, this past year, I guess we're 3 seasons in now, Toshi Reagan and I have been doing this podcast, and I find it very satisfying as a way to teach outside the classroom. You know, it's just like, okay, who wants to deep dive on these incredible texts? And like my dream come true is like getting to deep dive on them with Toshi. I'm just like, oh shit, you know, like who's smarter than you, Toshi Reagan? So we get so many messages and responses from people who are like, this is changing my life and changing what I understand to be possible for myself and my community. I'm like, good, because that's what Octavia does. And, you know, but I in every book, I think I tell people, just go read Octavia. Just go read her work. And like, I don't have to convince you of anything, you know, like I also, one last thing I'll say, because we're writers here too. I feel like Octavia as a writer is also a teacher because she wasn't the most poetic writer. She didn't really obscure anything, you know, like I think of like a Toni Morrison and it's like, you got to get in there and kind of like weave yourself through, or like a Toni K. Barbaro. It's like, let me find the rhythm of this. Octavia was just like, it was like this. And then we hit the road and we went over there. It was hard. We were hungry. I was crying. I met Bankole. Things were good. We had sex. Boom. Right. Like this is very like you know, rereading Wild Seed. And I'm like, this is a beautiful story, but told very directly and in a very straightforward manner. And I think that's also important for writers to understand because we all have different strengths. And sometimes it's just like, get the story told, you know, like if you're telling a prophetic story, it'll stand on its own 2 feet. Tell the prophetic story.
Oh, I love that. I love that. This question about teaching Octavia is so generative. I mean, I feel like, and I'm like, I wish Charles was here, you know, like pedagogically to teach it to middle schoolers. I feel like I struggled, honestly. Mm-hmm. I think that like there was a long time before the context of the emergent strategy path and the parable path with Toshi's opera, where I was like really trying to have people read Octavia Butler's work with me and people were getting stressed out, you know, like it was just like,
it's hard.
it's hard, you know, and I feel, I mean, it's interesting because now I have this whole online portal and course around Octavia Butler. And it's like,
well, don't rush over that. Tell people what you have.
There's this, it has 2 parts. So there's this God is change, kind of like what if Octavia Butler was your life coach, basically. Yeah. So drawing on Octavia Butler's work and her relationship to work and her, and honestly, her role in my life, her transformative role in my life, because my relationship with Octavia Butler as a chosen literary ancestor is so much more jagged than my other chosen ancestral relationships. Like, I feel like she shows up in my dreams and is like, you need to rethink that wake up, you know, it's not like, it's more like, and I love that. And I'm so grateful for that. And it's so motivating. So the question is like, okay, well, how to have a container, you know, where people are breathing, where people are held, but they can get like some tough love, hard truths type information, right. Because that's what Octavia Butler is bringing. And she's like, it's not a moment too soon. Like now, y'all, you know, like get it together. And it's been so beautiful to be in collaboration around it, you know, like the fact of the thinking about the transformative justice reader and thinking about the parable path. Right now for parable path, I'm helping to facilitate part of what the next, the opera Parable of the Sower is going to be in DC, and there's the theaters that are sponsoring it are also sponsoring a youth program where they're shepherding these young activists. Basically, they're, you know, there are little Olaminas.
Exactly.
They are creating their own community projects based on the changes they see for their communities. And so I was tasked with training their facilitators. And it was so generative to go back to the parables as a guide for understanding teenagers as prophets. Yes. You know, for the people who are the facilitators of these youth to be like, okay, we're going to do some time travel. We're going to do letters from your younger self to you now, guiding you to facilitate this. We're going to, we're going to think about what it is to leave home. And, you know, this idea of how sacred it is to be in someone's life at that earth seed moment, in the sense of the gestation, like the point at people's lives at which they are actually, if we were honest about it, everybody is like creating their own religion. They're having this worldview. They're creating a theory of change. They're deciding how they're going to interact with other people and their values around that. And to have any role in someone's life while that's happening.
Yes.
So sometimes Octavia Butler represents this as like transition, when people are getting their powers or when people are maturing. It's different alien stages of life.
Yep.
It is a vulnerable time. It's a volatile time. And it's so sacred. So I'll just say that's a recent experience of I felt so much love being able to have an impact. It's like a meta impact, you know, like I'm not working with the young people directly because it's people in their communities, as it should be, who are working with them.
Yeah.
But I got to work with those folks who are holding space for them. And it's like, wow, what if we all thought about, like, when I go back and read my teenage diaries, I'm like super embarrassed. I'm like, oh my gosh, I was so dramatic. Like, you know, some of these crushes, I was like, they were not worth my poetry. But like, that was my teenage prophecy stage. And what am I still learning from that? You know?
Yeah. Well, and I love that also because I think of like the nibblings in my life. And right now, one of them is a novelist and has written 2 short novels. And it's all like fan fiction, and she's just writing nonstop. And I'm like, oh, you know, I think Octavia, like, I was that kind of kid, you know, I was like, I've got visions, I've got things to do, you know, and you know, I was lovingly encouraged, but with the way that you encourage kids, you know, I was like, sure. And I feel like reading Octavia has changed me as a teacher of young people and kids, babies, teenagers, et cetera, because I'm like, you might be the leader right now, you know, like it's not, I used to have an orientation of like, yeah, we've got to shape the youth so they can lead when they grow up. But I feel like Octavia was like, almost all of her protagonists are people who either are or appear to be very young and are holding the world. And I look at now the kids who have come through this pandemic and are like, I don't know what y'all used to do, but we run this house and I've got I know exactly what my career is. I know how I want to spend my time, like all of that. So it really helps me teach people. I'm like, whatever you're feeling and thinking right now is completely legitimate. It's a part of understanding the future for all of us. And I'm going to listen to you as a completely legitimate being. And it really changes the relationship. So what about for you, Mimi? Are you teaching Octavia too?
I taught her work recently for the first time, but it was a reading group. So I was not really speaking to people that I was teaching.
Yeah.
And so the interesting experience was that this was a reading group at the Center of Fiction, and it was supposed to be a live, in-person reading group, and the pandemic happened. So we met, like, I think 2 times, and then the rest of the reading group happened on Zoom.
Yeah.
And like right at the time that the apocalypse was starting. And what I found interesting, so these were all adults, and there was, I think, one person who had read her works already, and he was a fan, and he was coming back to read in a group. And he was ecstatic about rereading all the works, but the new people, so, I mean, the series are pretty long, right? And what I noticed is that, yes, the stories are very dark and difficult to read, especially, when a time when something like COVID happens, which reflects the experiences pretty closely. I mean, now we've been 2 years into it, so we're wiser, but, early in 2020, it was just panic, right? Yeah. And, but her works basically don't end on a sad note.
Right.
So like, if you're a person who knows where it ends, like that one person did, he enjoyed going through them again. Because he knew what note it's ending on, and the note is a higher note.
That's right.
But the people who hadn't read her work were really struggling, because they were like, this is too much truth.
They're like, there's no way out of here. Yeah. That's right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that piece around truth, maybe that's another piece of what she teaches us all the time. It's like teaching Octavia, but also still learning from Octavia that it's okay to tell the truth. It's okay to write the truth. It's okay for the truth to have a central role in your fiction, which I think for a long time I was like, no, if it's good fiction, it has to be totally imagination, like no, and I'm like, actually it can be truthful, and it can even be didactic, and it'll still be really relevant and helpful. I'm curious for each of you, I'd love to hear this, and I'm like thinking of it for myself. So I'm working now, I released last year my first work of fiction, and it's called Grievers, and it's about a pandemic basically that hits Detroit. And I'm in the second one now, and it's a trilogy. And I feel like I've been learning from Octavia about trilogies, and like, okay, so when you're trying to put some, like, how do you write a book? And she talked about that with the pattern master, that she wrote the pattern master first, and then had to be like, how did I get there? How did I get there? How did I get there? And I'm wondering for y'all, like, as you're writing now, you're writing your own fiction now, do you find Octavia is helping you as a writer, is pushing you as a writer, like reframes or adjust how you approach what you're writing?
That's such a great question.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, you always have such great questions. You're like, that's what you could count on me for. I'm gonna have a good question.
I'm like, I'm gonna ask a question.
They're always so generative. It's one of the things I'm so grateful to you for. Yeah, I mean, thinking about it in this moment, I think that Octavia is with me more in like the practice, like how to relate to the practice of my writing. I think that my writing is so different from Octavia's. I don't necessarily see it as
like from anyone's.
I don't see it as similar in form,
mm-hmm.
even though it's so similar in the reason for it existing, and it certainly is informed by her writing. But I think that just like what she taught in Bloodchild and just through her life about practice and about habit. And, you know, I talked to you about this for a million years, Adrienne, but one of the things, I mean, she showed up in 1988 at the Essence Women's Writers Retreat and was like, here's a writing activity because I want these other Black women writers to write science fiction. Like she showed up with a writing exercise for other people.
Yes.
And so I didn't get to be her student, you know, directly. but we are, right? I mean, like we're so her students. So when she says habit,
yes,
you know, trust habit, don't wait for inspiration. It's like my life is designed around that.
Exactly.
Of like continuing to show up, or then, you know, being able to do the archival research and see her correspondence with other Black women writers, especially thinking about boundaries and how she protected her writing time and how she was specific about, you know, writing to Toni Cade Bambara, like, I want to collaborate. I'm so excited. Like, yes, we should talk on the phone, but don't call me at night because I'm writing. So I'm not going to answer. Like, I'll just let you know now, you know? And I think that that's one of the first messages, like when I felt like Octavia Butler was kind of like telling me about myself in a relatively harsh way.
Yeah.
The message I got very clearly was, you need to have boundaries, because if you don't have boundaries around your writing, you're going to resent other people for taking up time that you yourself should have dedicated to writing. You're going to be sitting in the meeting like, oh, I wish I was writing instead. And ain't nobody told you had to schedule this meeting during a time that you would rather be writing. And so I think that the way that Octavia Butler has helped me with my writing is being like such an example of taking responsibility for it. Like, I'm responsible for whether or not it happens. Yeah. And I'm responsible for following, you know, what she calls my positive obsession. Yes. Like, it's my positive obsession for a reason, and nobody's as obsessed with it as I am. And no one's as obsessed with me doing it as I am. So I can't expect them to protect my boundaries. Like, I have to do that. So yeah, I think that's what she's teaching me, and it becomes more and more specific all the time. And but I'm excited about. Just as a note, I really love what you said about the Patternist series, and I think that's part of why Wild Seed is my favorite. Pattern Master is one of my least favorite.
Yes.
And I'm like, what is it like to go backwards? You know, like start with this image of a futuristic world and go backwards and backwards and backwards. And I feel like as she goes backwards in that series, the characters get more and more complex and rich, and they teach me more. Yeah. So I think that that's also part of what you've taught me, Adrienne, because when you invited me to be part of Octavia's Brood, and you and Walida introduced me to this idea of visionary fiction, and the workshop that you did at the AMC that y'all did around visionary fiction, it was like, okay, like go to the edge of what you can imagine, and then look at what has shaped my imagination to even be like this, you know, like that is, that's phenomenal. So like that in itself is a phenomenal form of time travel that she modeled in the way that she wrote those works and the questions that she asked herself, that I feel like you've brought into my practice, because I didn't even see myself to be writing anything visionary science fiction or futuristic. But then you were like,
how ridiculous is that?
You time traveling every time you write.
Like, that's all you talk about is time travel. You need to write it down.
Right.
What about you, Mimi? How does Octavia impact your writer practice?
Well, one of the things that I think about the Patternist series is, I have a non-chronological series of like short fiction which happen in the same world, and I used to apologize about it. Like before I read her work, I used to apologize about it. I felt that this just shows how disorganized I am as a person. And once I read her work, and also I read about her life, and I placed Octavia in her context in the world. Now, I mean, I'm from India. I'm from a fairly lower middle class background, and I'm from a community called Dalits, which is like a caste thing. And I had not seen myself as a writer, and I had not thought it was possible. I had relatives who told me that people of our background can't be writers, right? Which is something that reflects in Octavia's experience. And so when I wrote those stories, I was not expecting them to be published. So yes, they have gotten published, non-chronologically, because I came to them non-chronologically. And like Alexis points out, I mean, if you don't read those stories, you'll see that while they go backwards sometimes, they actually get better. So I learn as I write them. That is one thing I learned from her. And the other thing that, Adrienne, you were talking about, the abruptness, the very straightforwardness in writing. Because I came from a tradition of Indian writing, which came out of magical realism, Indian magical realism, Salman Rushdie, etc., which is a very different style of writing. And sometimes as a Dalit person, those myths are not accessible to me. So those are, I mean, that is not a tradition that I'm a completely direct and descendant of.
Right.
And so, I mean, while I'm not American, while I'm not Black, somebody like Octavia Butler in her social positioning reflected a little bit of mine. Yeah. There was a little bit of parallel there, which I carried from, I guess.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I mean, I'll share just that same thing. I was thinking about that today. The habit is more important than talent. And I was definitely one of those kids that was like, I'm a gifted kid because my parents say so, for no other reason, they think I'm smart, and I started writing at an early age, but I think I always struggled with the idea of not being great right out the, I'm like, I just want to write a great American novel. I want to write a great short story. And there's been so many points in my life where I was like, you're not great at fiction yet. You're actually great at nonfiction. You're great at poetry. You're great at these other things, but you're not really great at fiction yet. You'd have to have it, because fiction, especially long form fiction, takes habit. You have to be like, I am going to immerse myself in this world and with these characters, and they can count on me to show up every day to hear their story. And, I don't know if that's how it works for y'all, but for me, I'm like, oh, that's where we're supposed to go. That's what we're supposed to do. And I just have to be so available to hear it. And the habit of making myself available for the work. And I think many people, writers, we always have another job. It's I'm also, whatever, teacher, professor, facilitator, do that, all these other things. But for the longest time, I was like, why am I not able to get into the novel, get into the long form fiction writing, but I can do all this other writing? And it was reading Octavia over and over again and being like, oh, I haven't made a habit of that. And now, similarly, I feel like I'm shaping my whole life around, and I'm constantly renegotiating the boundaries. I'm like, hold on, that's still too much because I still didn't get enough time. Hold on, I still feel pulled out. Hold on, and Michaela Coelho recently came out and gave this speech, and she was like, you have to be willing to disappear. And I was like, that feels like School of Octavia teaching, that I'm like, Octavia, I don't think that she would have just been on Instagram all the time. I feel like she would have just been like, I'm grinding and here's my book, or here's something related to that. Now I'm back to the grind. So I'm trying to figure that out. I have all these little reminders built into my phone that are get back to it. I am a writer. I'm going to write. Octavia Butler, habit is more important than talent. They just pop up all day. So if I've gotten distracted, it feels like Octavia comes and just picks me up and puts me back on track. And then I think the other thing that I learned from reading about Octavia's life was how obsessed she was with taking in lots of different information. So she was always, reading about like, what are these sea slugs doing? And like, what's happening with the climate? And like, what is Reagan up to? And like, what's going on over here? And like, you know, that she had this very voracious, wide curiosity. So she was like always, yeah, just exposing herself to more and more things. And you could see that show up in the text. So I'm also in the habit of cultivating my curiosity, especially when it feels like it's shutting down, where I'm like, we're all gonna die. I already know it. You know, it's like, hold on. Is there a documentary about nature that you can go watch and like learn something new about mushrooms? Is there? Yes, there always is. Me and David Attenborough are in the game. You know, like there's always something there. Now it's Will Smith. Will Smith is my latest like narrative strategy person. I'm like, oh, you don't know, but we're doing this. But you know, and then being like, okay, what are oppositional voices up to, and what are they saying, and what are they feeling, right? Like, I don't understand this perspective. Can I go read about it? Can I try to open myself to it? If I had to write a character who was like, no vaccines ever for me, you know, I'm like, how would I write that? Like, how could I get into that? You know, what can I learn from trying to see all these things and then be willing to just keep looking, like not look away. And I think so much of what Octavia teaches us as writers is like, if you don't look away, you can help others continue to look at what is. And it's only from looking at what is that we can be like, oh, that's not going to work. We need to do it differently. And I want to bring in Lilith's Brood here as Xenogenesis, because, you know, when I look at all the books together, it's like Parables is like, okay, what about right now? You know, Kindred's like, what about going back? You know, Pattern Master is like, okay, over a long arc of time, you know, development, but in some way it kind of skips over the present in a way. But then the Lilith Brood, the Xenogenesis, is like, okay, but you know, if we just cannot figure it out and we don't get it together and the planet does go into this other state, what would be important about humanity to carry forward? And something about that question hits me at such a profound level that I'm like, in my life every day, you know, right now, I want to be writing texts that make people feel like, oh, I know what the best things about being a human are. I want to practice those things, and not in a performative way, you know, like I don't want to just do it, but I'm like it's really transformed me. You know, I'm like, oh, I would want to be really good at knowing how to love. I want to be really good at like assessing boundaries. I want to be really great at knowing how to show up for people without losing myself in what they're going through or whatever. Oh, my plant light just went off. You know, I want to take care of plants. And I'm like, I want to think of myself as a steward of things that are not human, and let them steward me too, you know? So those things about Octavia, like having that voracious curiosity and being able to stay in contact with what is human and what is worth surviving. You know, even if the future is like mostly not humans, and we're just taking a little bit from you guys, you know, I'm like, I don't want the best thing we have to offer to be cancer. I want it to be love or something else. So, yeah.
Oh, that's such an amazing answer. And like, I learned so much from both of your answers, because I am trying to write a novel, and this helps.
Honey, aren't we all? like we're all procrastinating right now, just so the audience knows. But we're here. But this will help us too, you know. And
I wish I have so many other questions to ask, but we've also run out of time.
Yeah.
So thank you, Adrienne. Thank you, Alexis, for this great conversation. Like, I don't know if we can continue later, but
yeah, please. Mimi, it was so good to meet you and to connect with you. And like, you know, I also love this idea that being responsible about what we're writing. It's like the three of us are writing fiction, and that will feed into the genre, shape and change and adapt the genre. And it's exciting to be self-aware in that work, you know? So I'm excited for your novel. I'm excited for your next work, Alexis, around Audrey. And I know your next novel is going to be fantastic also. So thank y'all. Thank you, City Lights.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. A blessing to be in community also.
Yeah, and thank you, Octavia. Oh, I wanted to show you guys this before we go. he's got this new little tote bag.
Oh, cool.
That's so great.
How adorable is this?
And truer words have never
was like,
been.
Boom, it's from this group called Simply Literary Co. But this is my collection of like all things like so I'm like, oh, I'm gonna find a way to fix the bag up here because I'm like not using it, but I'm gonna anyway. I love you all.
Thank you all. Thank you, Octavia.
Thank you, Octavia.